Howdy folks, I'm Mark. I make stuff, and today we're diving into part 6. Can you believe it's part 6 already? Part 6 of our Swatchity code along series, Swatch, Thread, and Replies. So what is Swatchity? Why does it exist? All that stuff. There's a link in the upper right. You can click on that. It'll give you all kinds of context. Everything will soon make sense. All right, let's take a look at the user story for SW006, the thread. When a user views the Swatch feed and clicks on a swatch, they will be sent to that swatch's detail page. This page will show a larger version of the swatch and list all replies to that swatch, as well as the likes for the swatch and the likes of its replies. The user can post a reply to the main swatch, they can like a reply, and they can like the main swatch. Let's take a look at how that behaves for the branch for this particular user story. You can see here we have our large and in charge version of the swatch post. It has a lot of the same stuff happening. We can like that if we wanted to. Then we have our reply feed down here, which looks very similar to our swatch, just formatted slightly differently. We have our load more in case there are more replies, and we can create a new reply if we want. We'll do that later. So let's dive into the code to see how all this is done. If we go to our pages, we have a folder for pages, swatch, and then brackets ID, right? That the ID comes through the URL parameter, and we get that from context query like we did before. We get the server-side session, and we pass that along to our server-side function that's going to pull in our thread data. We get all that thread data, we serialize those dates for the replies and the swatches. You saw how we did that last time, and we pass that along to the page component as props. And we say initial swatches, initial swatch likes, that kind of thing, even though these three items can be mutated while this page is loading. But the initial swatch isn't really going to change. It's just a matter of keeping the nomenclature consistent. So let's take a look at what this get swatch thread db does. This is a server-side function that lives in our db functions file within our utils folder. Get swatch thread db pulls in a lot of information. Let's just see what it returns first. So it returns the original swatch, the likes for that swatch, right? So if you're a user and you have liked it, that's what we're going to see. We're going to see your likes. We also return the replies as well as the reply likes in a pattern that's very similar to what we were doing when we were reading the swatch feeds on the server side. So let's take a look at how we do this. We establish a few things and set them to default values because we don't know if the user is logged in, for example. If the user is logged in, we look them up. We look up the parent swatch based on the ID that was passed in. We want to see if the current user likes this swatch, and we want to pull in the replies. And the replies, as you might imagine, are based on this swatch ID. So let's look in the schema, and there it is. We have the reply and the reply like, and they're going to be very similar to our swatch and swatch like, but we wanted them to be slightly different to keep our types consistent. Similar to what we did with the swatches, we're going to look through the reply likes to find anything where the reply ID is in our list of reply IDs, basically this page full of replies, and whether or not we have a like that matches the user, the logged in user. So have you liked any of the swatches that are on the page, basically? So let's take a look at this content, and you'll see that our swatch detail page looks a lot like our swatch feed component that we reuse on all those different pages, right? So it has a layout, it has header buttons, it has refresh, load more, and load swatches. You'll see the same kind of patterns happening here. Slightly different types. Some of the logic is a little different, but that's why we couldn't completely reuse it, but it's the same idea. We have our header buttons, which again, similar but not exactly the same. In our JSX, you can see we have our swatch post here. We pass in an optional prop called isFeatured, and isFeatured makes it a little bit bigger, kind of a Chongus swatch, our absolute unit swatch. And then we have our replies feed. So reply post is very similar to Swatch post, but again, some of the logic is different, some of the styling is different. We wanted it to nest neatly inside of these columns. We wanted everything to be flush right as opposed to flush left, so they look a little different. And we don't need the same kinds of buttons here. But the rest is basically what you would expect. We have our no replies, we have our load more, right? All of that is what you would expect to see on the Swatch feed, just slightly different. Let's look at this a little more carefully when it comes to creating a new reply. So once we open this new reply like this, we get our new reply here. So what's happening in the background? We opened it, and then once we hit OK, it created the new reply, and then we close it. The function that does all the work here is called create reply in our API functions. So this is, again, a very similar pattern. We're hitting our internal API route for API reply, create reply. Let's take a look at those. We'll start with create reply, but we're going to look at all three of these. So create reply has some heft to it. We're looking at the server session. Again, we always want to know who is it that's doing this. We look up the parent swatch, mostly to make sure that it actually exists. And then we're checking the validity here is manyfold, but we'll want to make sure that you're actually logged in when you're doing this. We want to make sure that you're who you say you are, and we use this validate with rules that we looked at earlier, right? We have specific create swatch rules that are similar to some of the other rules that you've seen in other sessions. We look up the user who's posting it. We create an extended reply, which is similar to the extended swatch, if you remember. So all of that information's there, and then we just check for success, and we update the swatch with the number of replies, right? We recount the number of replies. We create an alert. What's an alert? Well, alerts are what we're going to go over in our next session, but the main source of alerts in the application currently is when someone replies to your Swatch post. So when someone replies, the author of that swatch, the parent swatch, will receive an alert from the system. It's not like an actual notification. They'll just see it down here and they'll get that little badge there. So we create it with the Swatch user's ID. We use the noun to get the user's name, and we get the link. And the link basically is a link back to this. And then after that, we check the user score, which is very similar to what we showed you earlier, but we now include reply likes to that. And then when that's all done, we check your user level. If your user level has changed, we update that on your user meta record. Let's look at read replies. In this one, we're reading the list of replies based on who you are. We're passing all that information down, but we're using that same function you saw earlier, get swatch thread DB, a server-side function where it gets all of this information. That's all it really does. We're just basically taking the same function that we use during the get server-side props and making that available via the API for pulling stuff back in. Set like reply is very similar to set like for the swatch, right? So it's almost the same pattern exactly. We're just saying if the reply like exists, we're going to delete it. If the reply like doesn't exist, we're going to create it, right? And then just like the other stuff, we're going to check the reply likes. We're going to count them up. We're going to update the reply with the new reply likes, and we're going to check the user score, which implies that we update the user, the author of the reply, if that's warranted. That's all there is to this one. This is a short session because it's a fairly simple story, but you get the idea. We'll like this reply. We'll create that lavender. What's that lavender? Next up, we're going to be talking about those alerts that we were just looking at. We created an alert for the author of this, and then in our next session, we're going to actually talk about how we display those within the application and alert the user. Hope to see you then.